So welcome to our first hybrid meeting of the Historical Society. It's our first ever hybrid meeting, but it's welcome back to everybody that's here in person. So glad to see everybody. And we have a special presentation today from somebody who is a descendant of one of Brentwood's own. Timothy Lodice is known as that 30s guy. He's a scholar of 1930s American history. He has a Master's of Art in History, as well as a Master of Science in Management. Tim is currently working on his PhD at Liberty University. Now, Tim's connection to Brentwood is very strong, considering that he's our very own Bruce Fabrizio's nephew. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tim Lodice.
Fully vaccinated. Yes, it's an honor to speak to you here at the Historical Society, and thank everybody for letting me talk. Like she said, both of my parents grew up in Brentwood. I grew up around Ronkonkoma, but both my parents grew up in Brentwood at completely different ends of Brentwood. So they didn't actually know each other because my mom went to St. Anne's and my dad went to public school. They met each other in college at Farmingdale. Yeah, they both grew up here, so it's my blood kind of. But my area of expertise is in the 1930s and the Great Depression. Always found it very interesting period of time. I guess hard times are always kind of interesting, a lot of good stories, and also have to build up to the World War II and everything. But it's really the early 30s and the early Depression that I focus on, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about the Depression. And right now I'm actually through with all my classes. I'm just starting my dissertation now, and it's about how I'm arguing that the American people really didn't think anything was substantially wrong with the American economy until 1931, not the stock crash of 1929, which is always conveniently stated. But if you look closer at the facts, there was a recession after the stock crash, but the economy largely recovered after that. Actually, most of the, by the spring of 1930, more than half of the gains, half the stock market was gained back, and employment was actually on the uptick. And then towards the end of the year, it went down again. And 1931, there was another uptick early in the year, and then there was this giant European banking crisis. And this is what people don't know about. This is what really caused the Depression. And there's actually was a book just released about it, and about the European bank crisis. All these banks, starting in Austria started to do wanted to do a customs union with Germany, which was against the Treaty of Versailles. France didn't like it, so they pulled all their money out of Austria. Do it really short, just to give you some background. And basically, it started a wave of bank failures all over Europe. And America had loaned a lot of money to Europe in the 1920s to help them rebuild after the war. And when those started defaulting, it started collapsing. Banks started going out here in 1931. And it was really the banks that caused the Great Depression, because everyone lost their life savings. A lot of people did. And then after that, they didn't trust banks. Nobody wanted to put their money in banks. And a lot of banks went under, and banks didn't have money to loan anybody either. So, and that was really at the heart of the Great Depression. Stock crash was a sensational event, but not a lot of people had money in stocks back then. It's just maybe upper middle class rich people, but more people than previous years, but still compared to today, it was a very low percentage of people actually had stocks. So it really didn't affect that many people. And if you look at the employment numbers, wages really didn't go down after that. There were some layoffs, but nothing massive. The massive layoffs didn't happen until 1931. And so I'm taking a social angle. I'm using social evidence to show how the American people, there was no sense of alarm whatsoever until the fall of 1931, when actually the event that caused it was Great Britain left the gold standard, and they were sort of the standard world currency at the time. So that was a huge event, and then a lot more people started pulling their money out of banks, and there was a panic. And the last 2 weeks of September 1931, I think there was 2,000 banks a week were closing down throughout the country. So that's all money that was just disappearing all of a sudden. And I'm doing some interesting research. Like I'm looking at one of the things I'm doing a few things. I'm looking at old yearbooks, actually, because it was really popular in the 30s for high school yearbooks that ask students what their ambition is. And if you look before 1931, 30 and 29, you get a lot of serious answers. And after that, you get a lot more cynical, facetious answers are all over after 1931, because that's when things were bad and people realized they weren't going to get whatever job they really wanted. So that's one of the things I'm doing. I'm also showing how movie themes and magazine articles also turned a lot more negative after 1931 and not so much before. Anyway, I'm going to talk about an interesting event in Brentwood that is not well known. I was trying to find something that I read the book by Vern Dwyer about the history of Brentwood, so I wanted to find something maybe that he missed in that book, and I found this interesting episode in 1933 where someone was trying to start a bunch of chicken farms here. And I stumbled on this because one of my personal projects is I read the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which was the most popular paper on Long Island in the early 30s. I read the front editorial pages from exactly 84 years ago. I started March 1st, 2015, which was March 1st, 1931's issue. And I've done every day till today, every single issue I've read the front editorial pages, and I've learned a lot of interesting little stories. I mean, some of them are useful to my work. Some of them are just really funny. Like there was one about I think it was 34, they put in motion sensing doors, one set of motion sensing doors in Penn Station. It was brand new technology and they were really excited about it, but they had to take it down after a half hour because people were so fascinated with it. It was blocking traffic, and I said there was a crowd of people in front of this door because they thought it was nice. So they took it down and made it a revolving door again. But yeah, it's I look at it online and you can clip articles out and save them. So, and I stumbled on this article. I'm going to read what the headline was. This is what caught my attention. This is August 3rd, 1933. It says, Long Island offers back to soil experiment with newly established broiler factories. Broilers like rotisserie chicken. And the subheading was enthusiasm and optimism mark colonies established at Ronkonkoma and Brentwood. Men and women drawn from city to seek solution to economic problems. And between May and September, there about every other week or even every week, there was at some points, there was advertisements for people to go out to Brentwood to start a chicken farm. People had no experience, but if you put money down, they said they give you the land, depending on how much money you spent, they give you more, but they give you the knowledge and they give you tips on how to raise these chickens, and they guaranteed you to make money because their angle was that there was a big market in New York City for cheap chickens, because right now they were importing them from the Midwest, and they were saying that if we can grow them in Brentwood and Ronkonkoma, they could be cheaper and fresher. And they were telling people that they could make $25 to $50 a week, which is pretty good. That today would be like between like 500 and 1,000 a week, and with unemployment, that was pretty good. Anything over $20 in 1933 was a pretty good wage per week. And it said, this was some excerpts from the article. Investors become owners of land and earn profits through the raising and marketing of chickens for broiling. The company supplies experts to teach and apply the latest and most approved methods to the raising of broilers, and then supply a cooperative method for their marketing. And they had a big article, and they actually had examples of people who did this. One was an ex-police officer from Great Neck who retired from, or he resigned from the police to become a chicken farmer in Brentwood. And he said he was very happy that he did this and that he was making money. And there was another guy who got fired from the Bell Telephones and was living in a tent while he was building a bungalow by hand. Now, where these chicken farms were, I couldn't find, I looked really hard. I looked through all the maps they had in the local history room, and I went to the Ronkonkoma Historical Society. I looked there to find where this exactly was, and the only information I could find is that it was off Suffolk Avenue. That's all they said. And the advertisements always says within walking distance of the train station. So that could be anything. especially if they're trying to get people to go. But they actually offered free transportation, and they always mention that in Brentwood, they have electricity, stores, schools, and churches. So, because people probably thought, you know, this is out in the woods, there's nothing going to be there. And but what's confusing me is I noticed it's as I researched it more, they wanted $920 minimum investment, but you could pay over time. But that was a lot of money. And if you're trying to attract unemployed people, I don't know how they were going to raise. I mean, that today would be like $20,000. So I don't know exactly how they were going to raise that. The company was called the Eastland Realty Corp, and it was run by a guy named Randolph Cohen, who I looked up, and he was in Long Island real estate before that. The earliest I could find was 1930. He was advertising for residential properties in Western Suffolk County and Babylon and Bayshore area. So he was in the realty business. I don't know what made him come to the chicken idea. Maybe someone told him about it, but he was the one that paid for all these advertisements that he put up. And they weren't small ones either. They were like half-page advertisements for these chicken farms. And I couldn't find out too much other information about him. I found in 1961, Suffolk County tried to sue him because they alleged that he was selling county land illegally from 1953 to 1955, but they dropped the case after a few months because they couldn't find enough evidence. And then in the 1970s, they sent some kind of petition to him to build fencing around Crooked Hill Road, because apparently there was a lot of kids bicycling there and it was hilly and kids were getting hurt. And so he didn't agree to put up a fence, but he agreed to put up caution signs. So it's, you know, he might have been a shady character. It's hard to tell from the few articles that I had.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
How old was
No, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, if he was selling houses by 1930, I would think he was probably born, you know, at least early 10 years of the 20th century. You know, it's must have been pretty old. But
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Was that chicken business lucrative? Did it take off?
Yeah, that's what I was getting to. I don't believe so, because after September 20th or September 16th, I'm sorry, 1933, so after only a few months advertising, no more advertising after that. And then there's another interesting story I stumbled on. On April 24th, 1935, there was an article about a woman suing Cohen, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, over these chicken farms, because they both said they bought property and that he didn't keep his end of the bargain, that they invested their money and they didn't get supervision or advice, and they didn't make money, and basically didn't get what they want. So I'm guessing this was some kind of crooked deal. Not many people probably did it in the first place. It was expensive, but the people who did probably didn't make much money. One guy invested $1,350, and he settled out of court for $150. But I guess so with the lawyers, maybe you know, at least he got something. And then the other was a lady, Blanche Connors, invested $1,800 and got $450 in an out of court settlement. So that's interesting. But yeah, Brentwood, from what I could tell, I mean, this was they had a very country image. I found interesting letter to the editor that somebody wrote that mentioned Brentwood. There was one guy who wrote letters all the time, usually about politics, but this time he wrote about how he likes to go into the country during springtime and talks, and he actually mentioned Brentwood as a place that he goes. And he wrote, "I long to inhale the balmy air in the picturesque countryside of Brentwood, which is free from turmoil and strife, and you're among the benign Long Island country folk." So a little different image, I guess, than today. But yeah, there was a movement around that time to go back to the farm because all the industrial unemployment, and there was Franklin Roosevelt actually mentioned it in a book he wrote shortly before his inauguration, but after his election, where a lot of it's just generalities. He really didn't mention anything specific, but he said that some Americans might have to go back to subsistence farming in the future. So there was a certain pull towards that. And it wasn't just around Brentwood, but I guess these chicken farms is one good example of it. It was pretty bad. 1933 was the bottom of the Depression. Unemployment was about 25% in March 1933 when Roosevelt was inaugurated, because it was just a huge panic, bank panic right before that. And if you're familiar with that time period, they for 2 weeks they shut all the banks down in the country. That was the first thing Roosevelt did when he took over, because banks were closing so rapidly. He wanted to reassure people, so he said he was going to close the banks and he was going to make sure they were sound and then open them back up. And they did check on some of them, not all of them, but it restored confidence. People, Roosevelt, his policies were kind of haphazard, and it's really debatable whether they worked at all. But he did restore confidence. That was the big. He was very reassuring, more than Hoover was. Hoover was very timid. He was not a good public speaker. He actually did a radio address in October 1931, after all those bank closures I talked to you about those 2 weeks of September. He realized he had to go say something, and it was the first major radio address by a president, and he did a terrible job. He lost his place over and over again. At one point, like 10 seconds, you just hear him shuffling papers going, But and he didn't really offer anything that they were going to do. He did do some infrastructure projects, but not very much. And after that, he was just always focused on balancing the budget instead of getting people jobs. And in his speech, he said that he was saying that we're going to go through a tough time this winter, but George Washington, Valley Forge went through a tough time. Other people went through a tough time, and we're just going to have to deal with it. It wasn't a very optimistic speech.
Pretty much on your own.
Yeah. He was. Yeah, that's what he said. Yeah, he said it's not the federal government's role to help. It's a local affair, so you have to get it locally. That's the way it's always been. So that's what we're going to have to do, even though it's going to be a rough winter. And then actually the funniest part is at the end of the speech, because this was the first big radio address, they have a guy in the background, a deep voice, say when he was done, "The President of the United States has spoken." And that's how they ended the radio address. They never did that again, but that was pretty funny.
Take it or leave it.
Yeah, because I guess they wanted to end it, some kind of impressive way. So it's a question. Yeah.
You said after 35, he closed the banks and then reopened.
33.
Is that when they federally funded the banks?
The FDIC officially, they started a program in 1933, but the FDIC officially started in 1934. And that was one of the good programs they came out with. It was controversial at the time.
That was under his administration?
Yes. That was definitely one of the plus ones. But the big program he did was the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, which was ruled unanimously unconstitutional. And that was a little too much. He wanted to have all the businesses come together and write a code for their businesses, where to set prices, to set wages, so basically everyone had to follow the same rules. It wasn't mandated, but if you didn't follow it, you didn't get to put this blue eagle, "We do our part" sticker in your window. And so the idea was people were supposed to boycott you if you didn't follow these rules. But since it was written by all the big businesses, they wrote it to benefit themselves at the expense of the small businesses. And a lot of small businesses went out, and that was really probably the worst program he came out with. And there was also a controversial one where they had such big farm surpluses. They had a thing called the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, where they paid farmers not to grow because there was so much surplus, and they just kept growing more and more, trying to make money, and the price just kept going down and down and down. So they were paying people to plow over their land so they couldn't grow on it, and the government would give you money. And people didn't like that because they said you're paying people not to work. And that was controversial. And that was actually also ruled unconstitutional. But there were good things like that. And Social Security was in 1935. And that actually was, the Supreme Court passed that with just one vote. It was a 5-4 decision to make that was legal. A lot of people didn't think that was going to pass the Supreme Court. And it did. But Roosevelt certainly tried, but he was not an economic genius. He was a politician, and but he was good at reassuring people. But I don't really blame, either him or Hoover so much for the Depression, because it was such unprecedented event. And I think if you had a guy like Roosevelt in when Hoover was in, people would have been clamoring for a less political person, a more, like a technocrat, like Hoover. Because Hoover was actually known as the great humanitarian before the Great Depression, because he, in World War I, he gained his fame by doing food drives to help the Europeans that were starving because there wasn't enough food. And then he became the food administrator for the United States. And he was able to get us farmers to produce unprecedented amounts of food that fed the whole world during the First World War. So he did some good things. The presidency was really like the worst part of his career. And he made some very bad statements that haunted him later on. During 1928 campaign, he made a famous statement that America was close to reaching the end of poverty as we know it. And then, of course, the poverty exploded after he became president. He was the one that said a chicken in every pot in a car in every garage. And, it's the early 30s, it was an interesting time. It was a lot of changes, and people were just unaware because they really hadn't had a big economic crisis since the 1890s. They had 3 pretty good decades of economic growth in the country. So this, they weren't accustomed to seeing everything collapse like it did, and caused a lot of problems. But I'll do some kind of rambling.
Didn't a lot of politicians make that same statement?
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did.
Huey Long saying something.
Oh,
about
yeah,
chicken
yeah.
every time.
Huey Long, yeah, he came in a little later, but yeah, he was. And Roosevelt was actually a lot more moderate. There was a lot of people who wanted to do a lot more than what he wanted to do, and Huey Long was one of them. He wanted to make it illegal for anyone to make over $1 million. If you made over $1 million, you had to give it away for public improvements. And he was seriously considering running for president for the Democratic nomination in 1936. And he was pretty popular, might have done it, but he was assassinated, so he didn't get the chance. Because he was assassinated by the son of a judge that he fired because he didn't like the judge, and his son shot him one day. So, but I see, people like him. There was another figure, Father Colin, who was on the radio, who also was a little bit more extreme than Roosevelt. He was very popular, and Roosevelt actually, the second half of his presidency was fighting Congress to balance the budget. Congress wanted to spend more than he did, and he was actually cutting some things, wanting to cut some things to help balance the budget. And a lot of people don't realize that either. That he was kind of in the middle, like the famous bonus that they were giving to the World War I veterans. He actually vetoed that, but it was passed over his veto. So, any interesting things you want to know about the early Depression?
I was born in 32.
Oh, okay, yeah, 32. Yeah.
That's more we needed to know.
That was the Depression.
That was a big election year.
Oh God, now you're gonna know my age.
Oh,
Very interesting.
Oh, thanks, yeah. Let's talk about the Great Depression. Yes.
So why don't you tell everybody about your podcasts?
Oh, okay, yeah, I have recently started a YouTube channel where I'm that 1930s guy, and I make videos about interesting events that are not well known, like this chicken farm thing, because I have a lot of interesting little stories I mostly gained from reading newspapers so much from the 30s. And I go to the sites where they actually took place, and I talk about them. And there's other things like I went to all the Fire Island inlets. 2 of the inlets on Fire Island were created from storms in the 1930s. And it was a very rare event because the inlets, usually it's like a 1 in 100 year event, but there happened to be 2 that were created in the 1930s. One was just created in 2012, actually, Hurricane Sandy, but
So they were actually all connected to Long Island?
yeah, eventually, for a long time, the Fire Island inlet, the one by Robert Moses Beach, was the only one for a long time. If you lived out east, you'd have to go all the way out through the Great South Bay to get out to the ocean. And then a nor'easter in 1931 opened up a new one, which was it the Shinnecock Canal? I believe it was, no, it was Mauritius Canal, I believe. And so that finally gave them an opening. And then the hurricane of 1938, which was like one of the worst hurricanes to ever hit Long Island, made another in the Shinnecock Canal. So it gave two more openings into the ocean. So that was, I went to each inlet and I told the story of how each one was created.
I can tell you, I've seen Tim's podcasts. I've seen at least one of Tim's podcasts about the woman who came and murdered her children,
Oh, yeah.
which was gruesome. Oh,
But
it really,
it was a crazy story.
it was a
I
crazy
find it-
story, but very interesting. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that, how do they find your podcast, Tim?
Just go to YouTube and search the word that 1930s guy. It was on Long Island, but it wasn't in Brentwood. It was someone from Manhattan, and her boyfriend, who she was obsessed with, wouldn't marry her because she had two kids she was a widow. She had two kids from her husband that died, and he didn't want kids. So one day, I guess she just snapped and she took a train all the way out to the town of Brookhaven, in Brookhaven, the hamlet of Brookhaven, where there was woods, and she tried to set her kids on fire. She didn't have enough gasoline, so she winded up just trying to stab them to death. She killed one of them survived. And and then she went back to New York and, to try to act like nothing happened. But they caught her. It took like a day to catch her because the kid that lived was only 5 and he didn't know his last name, he only knew his first name. So they put his picture in the paper everywhere, and they said, if you know this child, anything about this child, let us know. And her babysitter recalled that she came the day before that happened and said that she was no longer going to need her services because she was sending her kids to some relative in New Jersey. And she recognized the kid, obviously she watched him. So she's the one that got her caught. But it was a really terrible story. But then the really crazy part was everyone that knew her said that she was a good mother. They thought she was a good mother. They said she bought her kids presents all the time. She seemed to really love her kids. So she must have just snapped it. I don't know.
No, it's YouTube, that 1930 guy.
Yeah, that 1930s guy.
Now,
Yeah.
when you go on the internet, you go to youtube.com, and when you get to YouTube,
It's a channel.
there's a
on
search,
Yeah.
there's a search engine, like one of those little, right,
Yeah.
things, and in that search line, you put that 30s guy.
That 1930s guy,
I'm
yeah,
sorry,
19, yeah.
That 1930s guy in the search row, and then you'll come up with
That's-
them. How many do you have up there now?
Oh, I think about 15. I actually just did one before this about some Brentwood stuff, something like that.
Oh, good. Okay, and thank you. And this, Mike, you have another question?
Yeah.
You had mentioned that the government was paying farmers not to follow their land.
Yeah.
I always thought that was because of the water crisis and the Dust Bowl that was happening.
No, the Dust Bowl actually, I mean, it hurt a lot of people, but it actually did what that program didn't do, because that program only lasted 1935, it was deemed unconstitutional. But that's when the Dust Bowl, 1934 is when the Dust Bowl got really bad. Because it wasn't just one drought, it was like year after year of drought in the Western Plains, and everything just turned to dust. And that actually, it helped the other farmers in other parts of the country sell, and it brought the prices back up. So it had some beneficial effects. Ironically, it wasn't good for the people that lived there, but
That's still in effect.
is it? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure they came out with another bill right after that, yeah. I forgot what it was called. But they kind of worded it differently. It came out with a similar program later.
Special program.
Yeah. You're right.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the name of that bill was.
I get a check every year.
Yeah.
It's still in effect. You're still getting money for that fund.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Tim, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I think everybody enjoyed it. I think it was. Thank you for joining us. This will go up on our website. Okay, when this recording comes through, I'll be putting it on the website. You can find it at brentwoodhis.org. Go to the videos page. It'll also be on the homepage. It'll be on our
I have
Facebook
a
page.
Card,
You'll be
I'll
able
hand
to
out to
find us.
everybody.
And at this point, I'm
I
gonna
got
stop the
the big ones.
recording.
Sure.
So we can
Look, but